Acts chapter 19, starting in verse 20, says, "So the word of the Lord grew mightily and prevailed. When these things were accomplished, Paul purposed in the Spirit, when he had passed through Macedonia and Achaia, to go to Jerusalem, saying, After I have been there, I must also see Rome. So he sent into Macedonia 2 of those who ministered to him, Timothy and Erastus, but he himself stayed in Asia for a time. And about that time, there arose a great commotion about the way." That's what Christianity was called, the way. "For a certain man named Demetrius, a silversmith, who made silver shrines of Diana, brought no small profit to the craftsmen. He called them together with the workers of similar occupation and said, 'Men, you know that we have our prosperity by this trade. Moreover, you see and hear that not only at Ephesus, but throughout almost all Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away many people, saying that they are not gods which are made with hands. So not only is this trade of ours in danger of falling into disrepute, but also the temple of the great goddess Diana may be despised and her magnificence destroyed, whom all Asia and the world worship.' And when they heard this, all the people and the craftsmen, they were full of wrath and cried out, saying, 'Great is Diana of the Ephesians.' So the whole city was filled with confusion and rushed into the theater with one accord, having seized Gaius and Aristarchus, Macedonians, Paul's travel companions. And when Paul wanted to go into the people, the disciples would not allow him. Then some of the officials of Asia, who were friends of his, sent to him pleading that he would not venture into the theater. Some therefore cried one thing and some another, for the assembly was confused, and most of them, they didn't even know why they'd come together. And they drew Alexander out of the multitude, the Jews putting him forward. And Alexander motioned with his hands and wanted to make his defense to the people. But when they found out that he was a Jew, all with one voice cried out for about 2 hours, 'Great is Diana of the Ephesians.' And when the city clerk had quieted the crowd, he said, 'Men of Ephesus, what man is there who does not know that the city of the Ephesians is temple guardian of the great goddess Diana, and of the image which fell down from Zeus? Therefore, since these things cannot be denied, you ought to be quiet and do nothing rashly. For you have brought these men here who are neither robbers of temples nor blasphemers of your goddess. Therefore, if Demetrius and his fellow craftsmen have a case against anyone, the courts are open and there are proconsuls. Let them bring charges against one another. But if you have any other inquiry to make, it shall be determined in the lawful assembly. For we are in danger of being called into question for today's uproar, there being no reason which we may give it to an account for this disorderly gathering.' And when he had said these things, he dismissed the assembly." Chapter 20, verse 1. After the uproar had ceased, Paul called the disciples to himself, embraced them, and departed to go to Macedonia. So, starting in verse 20 where it says, "So the word of the Lord grew mightily and prevailed," it ties itself immediately to what we looked at last week in regards to, and you guys, I'm sure anybody here remember the title was Imposter or Inspired. And so Luke, as he gives this account through the book of Acts in chapter 19 of Paul at Ephesus, he picks out these 3 things. He picked out the 12 disciples who needed to receive the Holy Spirit. He picks out these unusual miracles that we looked at last week that God worked by the hand of Paul. And we saw that they were unusual because it was different in that his sweat claws, right? Like if you wear a headband or something, an armband while you're working so you don't get sweat in your face, and you wore an apron of sorts while you worked in your craft. It says that even those things, when they were taken from his body and taken to people, that they would be healed, that demons would be cast out of people. And so it says that God was working in those days. This is one of the things that that Luke kind of highlights of the work in Ephesus. But that God was working these unusual miracles by the hands of Paul in that day. And then we looked at there was these sons of Sceva. And it says, when they noticed what was happening, it says they took it upon themselves to call upon the name of the Lord. And so they find a demon-possessed man. And they go over to him in a house. They get him in a house and say, "We adjure you by the name of Jesus whom Paul preaches." And the demon-possessed man looks at these guys and says, "Jesus I know, and Paul I know, but I don't know you." And he's differentiating authority, right? He's saying, "I don't know where you're coming in behalf of, but I'm acquainted with Jesus, and I know Paul, and I don't know who you are." And it says, the man in whom the spirits were leaped on these 7 men, prevailed against them, and beat them so that they were wounded, and stripped them naked. And these men went running down the street, beaten and wounded, naked. And it says that all of Ephesus heard this, what happened. And great fear fell upon all the people in Ephesus. And not fear as in terror and like that. There was this crazy expectation of this other power working to where even the supernatural demonic realm was subject to who this guy Paul was. Amen. In reference to the name and the person of Jesus the Christ. And so we looked at that. Right? People who come in behalf of their own thing, to get their own thing. The imposter. Somebody who claims to be something that they're not in order to get something that's not theirs. And so these men were imposters. They saw the attention, they saw all of that. And so as we went through there, we looked at the differences of that. They claimed, it says they called upon the name of the Lord for themselves. We looked at the drastic difference between the imposter and the inspired man. It says God worked miracles by Paul's hand, yet these guys, they did it for themselves. So we looked at the inspired man as a man who's used by God, not who uses God. Right? It's like, you have the power of the Holy Spirit in you. It is not up to you in any fashion to go out there and I'm going to do this or do that. God is going to do those things. You subject your life to Him. And so as we navigate all those things about the imposter, we looked at how the whole city, it says then, day after day they came forward confessing their sins and deeds in their life. And this was a city given over to witchcraft. This was a city given over to sorcery. This was a city given over to Greek mythology and Roman mythology. I mean, you look at all of the things that were taking place in the city. This was in every way a supernatural city. Just the influence wasn't the kingdom of light. It was the kingdom of darkness. And so there's this one man named Paul who comes in the midst of 400,000 as conservative numbers of citizenry in Ephesus. And God is honoring that there's this man filling in the gap in behalf of the kingdom. And the people are responding. And so whereas we looked at the fruit of the imposter was getting sent away, beaten and naked and running down the street humiliated, the fruit of the inspired man caused the people to come forward confessing their sin, pouring out their hearts. It says, and many who believed. That means Christians in the church, they were bringing their books forward, their magic books, their incantations, all their practice of the other arts. And as a side note, we noted, look, sadly in the church, that whole idea can be kind of like poo-pooed, like it's nothing real or it's nothing severe. The drug addiction in our culture is a form of sorcery. It's pharmakia, it's buying and selling of drugs, it's witchcraft. You don't know it and you might not get picked for it. Some people, they get high one time and their mind gets changed for good. Never get the same again. Some people get high for a long time and it never happens. But in the practice of it, you're opening the door. It's rampant in our culture. Rampant. And so there's Paul in the midst there. And the people, it says, they kept coming forward. They kept confessing. They kept pouring their lives out. And they were bringing all that stuff, that hidden sin and things they still had going on. Like, yes, I'm a believer, but I kind of still want to do the things that I find comfort and pleasure in. And that was what we looked at last week. And we closed out there. If that's you, and you want to bring that forward. It doesn't say, and I appreciated it, by the way. It doesn't say that they kind of, in the secretness, said, Lord, I know, you know me. Yeah, And just I just want to deal with this over here because I don't want nobody else to really know. It's not what it says. It says when the Spirit was moving in the city of Ephesus and fear was upon the people, and they weren't scared of Paul, they revered the God of Paul. That without concern, what is my neighbor Susie or my Uncle Harry going to say to me about if I come forward with this? They came, it says, in the sight of all. And so we looked at that. And then it says there in verse 20 where we started tonight, so when all of that was happening, it says the word of the Lord in verse 20 in chapter 19 grew mightily and prevailed. It means it couldn't be fought against. Right? It doesn't say there weren't attempts to overthrow it. It says it prevailed. The kingdom of darkness is always going to try to imitate and replicate the kingdom of light. Never be able to prevail against it. It says light has come into the world and men love darkness rather than light. It doesn't mean that darkness is winning. It means that man is deciding for darkness rather than light. And so there in verse 20, it says, so the word of the Lord grew mightily and prevailed. Verse 21 says, when these things were accomplished, Paul purposed in the Spirit, when he had passed through Macedonia and Achaia, to go to Jerusalem, saying, after I've been there, I must also see Rome. So he sent into Macedonia 2 of those who ministered to him, Timothy and Erastus. But he himself stayed in Asia for a time. Then it says in verse 23, and at about that time. So Paul's alone now again. He's there. There's other workers in regards to Ephesus, but Paul sends his workers ahead, some of the workers ahead. It says that about that time there arose a great commotion about the way. So this picture right here from verses 23 all the way to the end in verse 41 goes a little something like this. Paul is there in Ephesus. He sends Timothy and Erastus ahead into Macedonia. And this man named Demetrius shows up. And I was joking with Timmy earlier because he's a union guy. I said, brother, this looks like the first union organization in the scriptures. He's a silversmith. He makes most of his money making these little shrines to the temple of Diana, the goddess Diana. And so the effect of the gospel, as we saw, that it grew mightily and it prevailed, it's beginning to affect even his trade. Because the people who were once buying the bracelets and the charms and the things to set up their little shrines and worship to, they weren't buying them anymore. And so he says, hey guys, come on, let's get together. He gets a room, a couple hundred guys, I guess. And says, look, we're silversmiths. There's this problem with this thing called the way. This group, these guys, they follow who they say this risen Jesus. And as you go through those verses, he starts to lay out. It's affecting our profits, right? You get people's attention when it starts affecting their pockets. It says that they had their prosperity by this trade, and specifically in relationship to this idol worship of the goddess Diana. And so they're not happy about it. And then as you get towards the middle of the conversation, they say, oh, and by the way, right? The people who, it's really about money, and then they say, but it's going to affect the goddess thing too, right? Like she's going to be in disrepute. Their people aren't going to think she's anything. It says that this man, Paul, he's saying that they are not gods which are made with hands. They're understanding what he's saying. Right? If you chop a tree down and shave it up and put it as an altar, just remember, you just chopped the tree down and made your God. So, Paul is saying they're not gods that are made with hands. And we looked at that. Paul's gospel message all through as he's blazing through now this missionary journey. And so they do what everybody does when they're not happy. They get a pity party together. And they get all the people. Then they bring them into the open, kind of the crowded area at that time. The idea in regards to the theater there, they can hold about 25 to 30,000 people. It's still there today. You can go see it. And so they're clamoring one thing after another thing, this other thing, and it says there in the scriptures, and we're going to kind of then jump back and go through some of it, that the one didn't even know what the other one was saying. There was confusion. They were just kind of hollering. So you get the crowd going, you get the emotions flowing, right? It's like starting a neighborhood fight. You don't even know why you're going to fight the other neighborhood. You're just going because he's going. And so there's emotions flaring. There's all this stuff going on, and it's in relationship ultimately to the goddess of Diana, but really if you look in the scriptures, it's about these silversmiths whose pockets are getting hurt because Paul and the effect that God is having through him is changing everything about this community. That's what's happening. And so the city council comes out. I don't know if that's the term, but you know what I'm saying. The city council comes out and says, hold on a minute here. Hold on. You guys, you know, what could anybody say about the goddess Diana or the image that fell from Zeus from the sky? What are you making a big stink about something these guys can't do anything about anyway? We all know that it's true. And furthermore, you guys are charging these guys as temple robbers and as thieves. That's not who they haven't done anything wrong. It's remarkable. God's using the city council in behalf of the Christian. He doesn't know it. And he tells them, look, you guys got to take it easy because we could end up in trouble with Rome. They were a free city still under Roman rule, though. Fourth largest city in the empire. And the problem is that this work that God is doing through this one man named Paul, they say, look, we got to do something because you know not only in Ephesus, but in all of Asia, that this word has gone out. That things are happening. And so I just took a look for myself. I thought, well, I wonder what the population of Asia, and for your own geography in your head, Asia Minor in the scriptures is modern-day Turkey. So you understand where we're at in the world. In that day, I don't think including slaves, all the major cities in Asia Minor on the conservative side totaled 1.2 million people. This is a guy, he doesn't have a phone, he doesn't have internet connection, he doesn't have a car, he doesn't have a plane, he doesn't even really have money. He's working as a tent maker to provide for himself. He's not supported by some huge congregation, although he has a huge spiritual family behind him in Antioch. He's living and breathing Jesus Christ. And God uses this man to disrupt everything about Asia Minor. And so tonight's study is called The Gospel That Disrupts Everything. And if you think, well, Mike, I don't know if you can use the word disrupt and gospel in the same phrase. The word disrupt means drastically alter or destroy the structure of something. So when that gospel comes into a Christ-hating world, and God's got a plan and an agenda, guess what it does? It drastically alters or destroys the structure of something. So, in verse 23, a great commotion is risen about the way, Christianity. I wrote here, notice the commotion was about the sweeping changes Christianity was bringing. It wasn't about Paul's political ideas of policy and how government should work. That's not what the commotion was about. It wasn't about Paul's position on government structure. Should we be a socialistic society? Should we be a democracy? Is capitalism correct? That's not what they were saying. Their commotion wasn't about Paul and his hate speeches and his religious antics and debates. That's not what the commotion was about. The commotion was about what God was doing through these men. The commotion was about the way. And so they would be identified in those days in regards to being Christians as the way. Jesus would say, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And so a lot of these men were identified by what is called the way. A pattern in which, an example of, a road to, that whole idea. And so the commotion arises that in regards to this sweeping change that is happening in regards to Christianity. Not just religious principle, but the reality of relationship. A demon-possessed man is subject to the God of this man, yet not all of those others. You look at all of the things. Paul's walking through there at one point, and he's annoyed. We read the scriptures with the girl crying out, "These are servants of the Most High God who come in behalf of the name of the Lord." Right? What do you want with us? And it says there, greatly annoyed, he cast the demon out of the girl. And again, the people weren't excited that he cast the demon out of the girl. They were mad that they were losing money, their owners. That's a story as old as Jesus himself. He goes all the way to the Gadarenes for this guy. Legion. And he casts the demon. They say, "Don't deal with us before the time. Let us go." And he casts the demons out of the man into the pigs, and they run off the cliff and die. And the owners of the pigs, they don't come. Nobody's excited about the fact that the guy who they couldn't shackle, who always cut himself and lived in the graves and cried out and freaked everybody out, they weren't excited that he was sitting clean and clothed in his right mind. They said, "Leave us." They were rejecting it. So the overall disruption, the gospel itself was bringing to life, as usual in Ephesus and all of Asia Minor. Verses 24 through 27, Demetrius and the tradesmen's real concern was personal gain, with the mask of concern for spiritual things. Paul would write to Timothy later on. He would say, "If anyone teaches otherwise and does not consent to wholesome words, even the words of our Lord Jesus Christ, and to the doctrine which accords with godliness, he is proud, knowing nothing, but is obsessed with disputes, arguments over words, from which come envy, strife, reveling, evil suspicions, useless wranglings of men of corrupt minds and destitute of the truth, who suppose that godliness is a means for gain. From such withdraw yourself." So the gospel, over the course of 3 years in Ephesus, that's where we're at. He's going to soon depart. He's been there for 3 years. Not 30 years, he's been there for 3 years. It disrupts culture. It disrupts religion. That's huge. It disrupts business. And it disrupts politics all through Asia Minor. Again, the population was somewhere around 1.2 million people. These people are stirred up against the living, breathing reality of the living God moving among and changing the hearts of the minds of the people. All they use Paul and Erastus and Aristarchus and these guys and Timothy, they're just objects of this thing they're having a problem with. That's where God has decided to send power through. So the people who are wrangling against it, it's not per se Paul himself in the flesh. It's God working through these men, changing the entire landscape of the culture in Ephesus and all of Asia Minor. Jesus himself would say, in Luke chapter 12, verses 49 to 53, he says, "I came to send," and you don't hear these often, "I came to send fire on the earth, and how I wish it were already kindled. But I have a baptism to be baptized with, and how distressed I am till it is accomplished. Do you suppose that I came to give peace, notice, on earth? I tell you, not at all, but rather division. For from now on, 5 in one house will be divided, 3 against 2, and 2 against 3. Father will be divided against son, and son against father, mother against daughter, and daughter against mother, mother-in-law against her daughter-in-law, and daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law." Jesus would say at a different point, "Do not think that I came to bring peace on the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a man's enemies will be those of his own household. He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And he who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And he who does not take his cross and follow after me is not worthy of me. He who finds his life will lose it, and he who loses his life for my sake will find it." Right there in verse 35 where he says, "For I have come to set a man against his father-in-law, it doesn't mean he's going to put gloves on and fight his father-in-law. He's saying, when I come, right? When I invade an individual's heart, I step into the home in that situation. The word set there, set a man against, it literally means set him apart from his father. If there's unity, that's because they both believe. If there's no longer unity, it's because one has believed and one has forsaken. And he's saying there's going to be division when I come. There's going to be the separating of, the making the difference of. And you know what it is? If you try to sit and talk to a person who's opposed to the gospel, they don't like you. And it isn't you. If they actually knew you before Jesus, they probably love you. I mean, for me at least. I wrote here, the gospel is like a hurricane. Except, once making its way through a heart, a home, a community, a nation, it makes everything right. Right? These people are upset because it's changing their way of life. That's why they're upset. It's taken all that they find comfort in, all that they find security in, all that they find their reputation and their image in, and it's saying, no, this is all wrong. And they don't know what to do with it. Because God is using, think of that. There's a small fellowship of people that are affecting 1.2 million people. That's incredible. And so this hurricane that's sweeping through, whereas a hurricane in the physical sense would rip trees up and flip cars over and snatch roofs off of houses and kill people, when the gospel comes through and disrupts everything, it restores marriages. Amen. It restores the heart of children to their fathers and fathers to their children. It changes businessmen. It changes politicians. It changes everything about the landscape that the prince of the power of the air, the one who now works in the sons of disobedience, tries to sell this world over and over and over again, that this is it. It changes the landscape of all of that. It gives new life and power and authority that doesn't belong to the man himself, to the woman themselves. And it's for us. The Temple of Diana was one of the ancient seven wonders of the world. It was there for a very long time. If you were to have seen it in this day, it was 425 feet long. It was 225 feet wide. It had 127 marble columns supporting a roof that stood somewhere around 60 feet tall. That's without power tools. That's without pneumatic tools. That's without backhoes and skid steers. It's without all the machinery we have today. It was remarkable. And for some reason, these men who were silversmiths and this entire population, though all the pageantry of all these things set in place of idol worship and all that man could create himself, is being disrupted by the invisible God through men. And so I would challenge us, listen, that's for us today. It's not, oftentimes we can get in the place of reading the escapades of God in the Old Testament and what He does in the New Testament, and forget that the history of Christianity is very near us. And I pulled a few, and you guys can go on your own, but the Great Awakening in America was a man, George Whitefield. There were several other guys, but there was a man, George Whitefield. It says here, Whitefield was an Anglican priest and powerful orator with charismatic appeal. At the age of 25, he created a sensation in England, which then he makes his way to the States, by preaching outdoors and going over the heads of other priests to reach the congregations. In 1740, he brought the same defiance of authority to America, along with a savvy sense of the media. Newspaper ads announced his sermons. Messengers rode ahead to spread the news of his coming appearances. In 1 year, Whitefield traveled 5,000 miles through America, preaching more than 350 times as he traversed the nation. North to south, an estimated 25,000 people gathered in Boston Common to hear him speak. Another 12,000 heard him in Philadelphia, 8,000 in New York City. In 15 months, as much as a quarter of the country had heard his message. In 15 months. Whitefield's central theme "What must I do to be saved?" was not new. His preaching style was. Ministers traditionally wrote sermons in longhand and read the text out loud in dull monotone. It says here, the effect was often soporific, which means drug-inducing, made you fall asleep. Drawing on his youthful foray into drama, Whitefield memorized his sermons, spoke without notes, varied the timbre of his voice, and gesture without abandon. He drew freely on his emotions, crying out, "My Master and my Lord." Whitefield ignited the Great Awakening, a major religious revival that became the first major mass movement in American history. At its core, the awakening changed the way that people experience God. Instead of receiving religious instructions from their ministers, ordinary men and women unleashed their emotions to make an immediate, intense, and personal connection with the divine. From New England to Georgia, the revival was marked by a broad populist tone, touching all of the people that essentially nobody would think about. When you look at the annals of what took place, pubs were shut down. It wasn't because he went around preaching against alcohol. He was preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ. He was challenging men to walk with God, to recklessly abandon all the other things that they would find their identity in and turn to the Lord. I have an article here I'll give to you guys later on, but it's interesting. Benjamin Franklin wrote on George Whitefield, and I'll read one thing. Now, Benjamin Franklin was not a believer, but he was impressed by this man, George Whitefield, who went through Philadelphia preaching. And Benjamin Franklin was a notable man. He was a brilliant man. And there was something about Whitefield that he could not leave alone. He would go to listen to him speak. You and I know Spirit of God. It's not Whitefield himself. It's God in Whitefield. Benjamin Franklin wrote, "I happened soon after to attend one of his sermons, in the course of which I perceived he intended to finish with a collection. Listen, and I silently resolved he should get nothing from me. I had in my pocket a handful of copper money, 3 or 4 silver dollars, and 5 pistoles, which were Spanish gold coins. As he proceeded, I began to soften, and concluded to give the coppers. Another stroke of his oratory made me ashamed of that, and determined me to give the silver. And he finished so admirably that I emptied my pocket wholly into the collector's dish, gold and all. At the sermon, there was also one of our club, it was a literary club, who, being of my sentiments respecting opinions concerning Whitefield, and suspecting a collection might be intended, had my precaution." So Benjamin Franklin said to this guy, just pay attention here. He emptied his pockets before he came home. So this guy made sure he didn't bring any money with him. Towards the conclusion of the discourse, the sermon, however, he felt a strong desire to give and applied to a neighbor. So he talked to the guy next to him who stood near him to borrow some money for the purpose. The application was so unfortunately to perhaps the only man in the company who had the firmness not to be affected by the preacher. His answer was, "At any other time, friend Hopkins, I would lend thee freely, but right now, you seem to be out of your mind." So Whitefield would go about. This is early in American history. We're a 300-year-old nation. We're not like some 5,000-year-old nation. This is the beginning of one of the great moves in regards to the Spirit of God in our near past. There's another one, and I'm just going to read some of this stuff here. It was the Welsh Revival. And again, it was in 1904. It was 115 years ago. You guys would be more familiar with Billy Graham or with the Jesus movement of the hippies, right? It says the effects as revival fire spread across Wales in 1904 to 1905, although no official records were kept of the actual number converted, 150,000 is considered a very conservative estimate. During the first 6 months, people's lives were transformed by the thousands. This was indeed a sovereign move of God's Holy Spirit. Whole communities were turned upside down and were radically changed from depravity to glorious goodness. The crime rate dropped often to nothing. The police force reported that they had little more to do than supervise the coming and going of the people to the chapel prayer meetings, while magistrates turned up at courts to discover no cases to try. The alcohol trade was decimated, as people were caught up more by what happened in the local chapels than the local public houses and bars. Families experienced amazing renewal, where the money-earning husband and father, the breadwinner, had wasted away the income and sowed discord, but now, under the moving power of the Holy Spirit, following the conversion to be a follower of Jesus, he not only provided correctly for family needs, but was now with the family, rather than wasting his time and wages in the public houses of the village or town. Souls were saved, individual lives were changed, and society itself was changed. Countless numbers were converted to Christ. There are men and women still in churches today whose parents and grandparents' testimonies were that they were converted in the revival of 1904, 1905. Not only were individual lives changed by the power of the Holy Spirit, but whole communities were changed. Indeed, society itself was changed. Wales, again, was a God-fearing nation. Public houses were now almost empty. Those are bars. Men and women who used to waste their money getting drunk were saving it, giving it to help the churches, buying clothes and food for their families. And not only drunkenness, but stealing and other offenses grew less and less, so that often a magistrate came to court again and no cases were found for him. Men whose language had been filthy before learnt to talk purely. It is related that not only did the colliers put in better days' work, but also that the pit ponies were so used to being cursed and sworn at that they couldn't understand the orders that they were being given. Clean words. So their bosses now were talking in good speech, and the animals couldn't understand what they're... You know what it is. You got an animal, get this, right? You're cursing at the animal. It starts to understand what you're trying to tell it. Well, now they come in with good speech and a kind heart, and the animal don't even know how to respond to them. That's the kind of change that was taking place. Yet still the work output increased anyway. The dark tunnels underground in the mines echoed with sounds of prayer and hymns instead of oaths and nasty jokes and gossip. People who had been careless about paying their bills or paying back money they had borrowed paid up all they owed. People who had fallen out became friends again. So, in this city of Ephesus, in this region of Asia Minor, the gospel sweeps through and disrupts everything. Culture, business. That's what Demetrius is mad about. That's why he gets all the silver workers together. We're losing money. How we're deriving our profits, how we find our income. Oh yeah, by the way, this goddess Diana in the temple is going to fall into disrepute. All of it's changing. And they fight against it. For us, I would say something that Jesus says. He says, you are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It is then good for nothing but thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. You are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. So for us, in the days that we live, look, the gospel invades your heart. I mean, it did for me. I got saved while I was engaged to who my wife currently is while she was pregnant. You understand all that?
Amen.
And I came home and said, I can't sleep with you no more. And she thought I lost my mind. She legitimately, and it was the gospel, changing everything I thought I knew. Every system I thought I had personally nailed down. All the spirituality I think I'd obtained by that point. All the good ideas and well-intentions, all that stuff. And then it started to change my behavior and how I spoke. It was crazy. I remember the first time listening to Caleb. I thought, wait a minute. I mean, I didn't even know there was such a thing as Christian music. And then I'm driving this $1,800 minivan with transmission problems. Sounds like you're a missile driving down the street. If you ever had transmission problems, you don't talk about. You sound like a missile driving down the street. You're just, and you're only doing 8 miles an hour. But I'm so excited for Jesus. And I'm like, whoa, what was that? It sounded like one of these songs we sang at the church. I'm like, wait a minute. That's that song that we were singing at the You Came From Heaven to... I said, what? That's on the radio? And then I will put my rap back on. And I thought, wait a minute. 6 months into that. I'm not singing. What am I singing about here? Taking this, getting with that, shooting it, like the whole thing. Like, what am I actually saying? Changing my thoughts, now changing my speech, changing what I listen to. Because my heart changed. He did a work inside. Started to change how I behave at the job site. I used to go in there, foul language and all. Excited for Jesus, but foul. Then God changed my language. I started sharing Christ with the CEO. I know, I was homeless. I thought, this is great. I got a job, I got an apartment. I'm like living in Beverly Hills. Got my $1,800 minivan. Looked like a shark took a bite out of the front of it. Excited. Because the hurricane came sweeping through and was changing everything. My only deal with God was, if this is true, then have all of me. Started to change the people who I was talking to at the job. Remarkable. Blowing my mind. I'm thinking, wait, this guy's actually listening to what I'm saying. Changed my wife. It changed my children. We had a parent-teacher conference like a month ago, 6 weeks ago. And they said, well, the only problem with Hannah is she breaks out into spontaneous worship in the class. It's a little disruptive. So when we left, I said, good job, baby. What am I going to say? Are you kidding me? Good job, sweetie. That's the gospel. It's not just this, all right, Lord, I'm going to trade in what I got because I'm in a bad relationship. That's not the gospel. It's not, Lord, I got money woes and you're going to fix it. That's not the gospel. The gospel is when Jesus says to them, if you lose your life for my sake, you'll find it. That's the gospel. Paul forsakes everything. A man who had more than most of us will ever understand. Respect from his peers, education beyond what we understand, religious institutions revered him, schooling and honor among men, money and from an affluential family. He had all of those things. And he says, I count them as dung. Jesus would challenge them. You alone are the light of the world. There's the people out there who don't know Jesus. There's no other light coming to them. There is no other light. You, me, you're the light of the world. My challenge, not in my own words, let your light so shine before men that they might see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. This is a small group of guys in an insane population having this crazy success. Because he would say later on, I don't count my life as dear to myself. It's not mine. He says, I'm crucified with Christ. Nevertheless, I live. How freeing is that? The reality that you no longer live in this world. Your citizenship is in heaven. You're here. You get to live 2 lives in 1 lifetime. You're brand new. And God's Spirit lives in you.